Hey guys, my name is Graham Johnson, and welcome back to Tabletop Glory. Today we're going to be working on some Kriegsmen. The Kriegsmen are such an interesting faction. There are a lot of really interesting factions within the Astra Militarum, but the Kriegsmen, in my opinion, are some of the most visually interesting to me. Now you'll notice something interesting with the color palette I've chosen. I've not gone with a traditional color palette, and this is primarily because these are a dedication to all of the amazing stories we're hearing coming out of Ukraine, with just some of the amazing heroism that we are seeing. So I have taken some inspiration from their national colors and basically used their flag as my color scheme here. In any case, I hope you guys will enjoy today's tutorial. So we're starting out with some Macragge blue and some Fenrisian gray. We're also going to be adding some Telsius blue a little later on to kind of mix up a bit of a mid-tone, and that's going to kind of give us our trifecta of color for all of the blues. Now it's important to keep in mind that I didn't really have much of a plan for exactly how this whole thing was going to come together. Usually when I paint miniatures, I have a really good understanding of what the miniature is going to look like when it's all said and done. Now I had painted a bust of a Kriegsman a while back, and I was using that as some heavy inspiration, and eventually you will see it on the desk, just kind of using it as a bit of a reference for colors as well as how to do some of my weathering. But I'm basically kind of going at this in an order that feels relatively safe, where if I make a mistake I'm not going to mess something up. So if things feel a little bit out of place, that's because this is just my process for this set of miniatures. So starting out with Russ Gray, I still have a bottle of the spray primer from Games Workshop. I did that across all of the miniatures, and that's going to act as our primer base tone. And then I'm using Macragge blue on the outside of the vest and Fenrisian gray on the inside of the vest. My intention was that the Fenrisian gray will kind of have a bit of a fuzzy appearance and will maybe make it look as though these jackets are designed to help keep them warm. And then I will be building up my highlights as we go. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is as I build up my highlights, I'm using less and less of my more extreme highlight colors. In this case, I'm mixing Fenrisian gray into either the Macragge blue or the Telsius blue to create my highlights. You'll see more of that as we get going, and I'll talk more about it when that happens. But I'm doing that so that my shadows still have some highlights to the fabric, but they're not as bright as those that would be exposed to the sunlight. Now I'm mixing up a bit of a glaze between our Telsius blue and our original Macragge blue, and my reasoning for building this up through a glaze is I'm attempting to give this more of a leather-like appearance on the outside of the cloak. I really don't want their jackets to feel as though they're made out of something other than natural materials, as I feel like that would kind of take away from the miniature overall, as well as the aesthetic that the Kriegsmen tend to have. When working with a lot of glazes, a hairdryer can be really great to kind of help knock out some of the, tedious part of the drying process. I find that oftentimes I find myself setting projects down and then coming back to them much later than I should, whereas with a hairdryer I can just simply keep painting. So this is a Kriegsman bust I painted on a TikTok live a little while ago. We're going to be using that as some of our inspiration today for our leather, using Mournfang Brown, XV88, and Zandri Dust. And those are going to be our three colors we're going to use to do all of our leather effects. In fact, we're barely going to be using any Zandri Dust at all. It's just to do some extreme effects. And even then, I don't end up pushing it that far. I have the idea that these Kriegsmen are kind of like an elite unit, especially considering the fact that in the lore, we technically understand it that Kriegsmen just kind of throw themselves at the problem and don't really care if they live or die. However, this unit seems to have a medic, which seems to tell me that they're some kind of an elite unit, a unit that understands that it's important to live to fight another day. And so as a result of that, I think that they would have some pretty nice equipment, that they're probably well-equipped special forces type units. So I'm not going super heavy with the weathering on the leather. Now we're going to be doing all the straps in addition to the backpack and any kind of holsters or anything like that that may be on the units. I do know that some of the other Kriegsmen have holsters. None of the Kill Team Krieg unit have holsters, so I'm not really worried about that. But we're also going to be doing all the little leather straps on the rifles as well. So it's time to start our first level of edge highlights with our XV88. Now what you're going to notice is that there are a few places where I go all over the edges, such as like the backpack or any kind of pouches or anything like that. However, when it comes to the leather straps, I'm not as quite all over edge highlight. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm kind of picking and choosing, and I'm leaving spots where I'm not quite connecting the edge highlight together. In my opinion, this gives a bit of a scrappy appearance and gives the leather a more natural and worn look. If I were going to enter something like this into something, say Golden Demon, I would continue my edge highlight all the way across and then use my Xandri dust to create this scrappy edge highlight look. However, for painting miniatures that I'm just going to be playing with, that I have no intention on entering into any competitions, this look works just fine, and from the tabletop it looks amazing, and it really takes very little effort. I was able to knock out all the leather straps on this entire unit in a single afternoon, and that was while relaxing, watching YouTube videos, not stressing out about the miniatures, and not just trying to bang these out as quick as I could. And so this is a method that works really great for this sort of thing to apply to your whole army. And that's basically putting edge highlights where they need to be, i.e. the backpacks and the pouches, the things that are going to stand out, and then putting this scrappy edge highlight on all the little straps just to kind of give the illusion that it's all over, when in reality it's just kind of showing the wear and tear of those leather straps. Now you'll notice also that as I'm applying these edge highlights, I'm putting them in high wear and tear locations. So anywhere where there's belts and buckles kind of overlapping or mixing with each other, or places where the leather straps would be bending a lot, like over the shoulders, that's where I'm focusing the highlights. Switching over to Incubite Darkness, I wanted to keep the colors kind of dark again. My idea is that this is kind of an elite unit, maybe almost like a Black Opsy type thing. Now, so I originally had thought about using this Incubite Darkness on the pants. However, I decided to end up using it on both the boots and the weapon stocks to kind of give it this grippy appearance, whereas with the boots it'd kind of have this dark leather-like appearance, something that would be a nice durable boot. I left the pants that Russ Gray color, and we ended up just using some of the Fenrisian Gray as a highlight for those pants later down the road. In an attempt to get some more earthy colors going on the miniature, I decided to use XV88 on these leather straps around the boot area. And I'm going to also hit that with an Agrax Earthshade, and then I'm going to highlight with Xandri Dust. This is going to take it from a leather look and bring it more into like a fabric wrapping. If you look at early World War I trench warfare, a lot of the times they would wrap their boots all the way up through the pant leg to try to help keep moisture or water out of their boots. I imagine that this is what that is for these Kriegsmen. It was at this point where I had decided I was pretty happy with where my highlights had ended up, and I was ready to do my final edge highlights on the ruffles of the fabric. Now we're using Fenrisian Gray for this. However, if you weren't happy with it, you can always glaze up from there, especially if you've already started to put down final edge highlights. You can always paint over them, you can always put them back down. If you're not happy with a miniature, keep tweaking it, keep working on it, and get it to a point where you're happy with it. Now, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, when we're working with miniatures, we're never quite happy with the final result, and so you do have to eventually get to a point where you can call it done. Whether you want to come back and touch it up later and work on it a little more down the line, eventually we have to have a point where we're done with it. And for me, that was this stage. I would have liked my highlights to have been just a little bit brighter, and maybe I can come back to them, later down the road and get them to where I'd be happy with them. But for right now, I was pretty happy with the way things were looking, and I knew once I got all of my highlights and everything else all taken care of, I was going to be really happy with the final result. And also, as you can see on screen, I finally pulled my first Maniac today, where I set up my camera just way too close, and I kept getting the side of my head in screen. I'm just playing around with the camera a little bit, trying to figure out what works best. I think from now on I'm going to try to stick to having the camera almost above what I'm working on, as it seems like from this angle my hands get in the way a lot. So I apologize for that, but I'm just trying to find a better way to make a higher quality video for you guys. Now it's time to add a little pop of color. We're going to go ahead and use some Mephiston red, and we're going to go ahead and place this in appropriate places. So in the case of this flamethrower, I'm picking out one of the tanks underneath the gun, as well as one of the tanks on their back, to paint up in Mephiston red, as well as like in a few other places, like with the demolition unit, I'm choosing to paint the fuses and one of the detonators wire clamps. I'm painting that red as well. And then I'm going in and also picking out a few things to paint black, such as some cabling and some wires on some of the other units, as well as all of their gloves. Originally I was thinking about painting the gloves in some kind of a leather color, but I thought that was a bit over the top. I didn't want the hands to be something that was a focus of attention. I wanted it to be just another detail as part of the model. I wanted it to kind of blend in, but I also didn't want it to blend in so much that it blended in with the weapon like it was by leaving it the same color as the weapon. So that's why I went ahead and painted it black. You could choose really any color that you want, but I felt that black was a good neutral color in this case. And as long as we're knocking out little detail bits, we're going to go ahead and take care of some of our silvers and golds. Now I want to go a little bit heavier on gold than what I would normally do with these types of units, and that is simply because that my inspiration is Ukraine, and I want to add more yellows into the miniature. So a lot of the places where I would be using silver, I'll be using gold, and then I'll only be using silvers in places where I think it should be metal, such as like the mess kits on some of the hips, as well as on the guns themselves. And I'll be using a mixture of lead belcher as well as gunmetal gray from Vallejo. Now gunmetal gray is an alcohol based paint, and it is much darker than lead belcher. However, the combination of the two really allows me to get some really nice highlights as well as some really dark tones, especially when it comes to the weapons themselves. If you don't have gunmetal gray, you can also add a little bit of Abaddon black into your lead belcher and you'll end up with a very similar color. Or if you don't really trust yourself to get the mix quite right, you can do about 2 to 3 coats of Nuln oil on top of lead belcher and you'll end up with a pretty similar appearance, and then you can just use your lead belcher as a highlight color again afterward. Using some wog flesh and some warpstone green, we're going to go ahead and start putting down our wog flesh for the backpack, as well as the wog flesh for our base tone for the weapons. So everything except for the larger plasma gun, I'm planning to have that glowing part, those coils on the rifles, are going to be done up in green. Now they're not going to be super bright and vibrant, as most of them are in a stowed position, so I would imagine that they're either off or in some kind of standby, so they wouldn't be glowing red hot, or in this case green hot. But I'll be using warpstone glow to add a bit of a highlight, and then I'll add a little bit of yellow to that warpstone glow just to kind of push the highlights a little bit more. Now in this case, I am building up my highlights from darkest to lightest, so darkest on the bottom, closest to the rest of the body of the rifle, with my highlight on top. This is regardless of where the sunlight is coming from the rest of the miniature, as I imagine this thing is giving off its own light source. And then we're going to use some of that warpstone glow to just kind of dry brush around the outside edge of those coils to give a mild OSL effect, and that's object source lighting. I'm going to be making a whole video on object source lighting down the road, so I'm not going into huge detail right now about how I paint that, as I do have a very specific way that I do it that I think works very well. And now a part that I have been putting off for a while, and that is our yellow shoulder pauldron. Now I am using Everland Sunset and Uriel Yellow. Now the reason I've been putting it off is my Everland Sunset is not holding up so great. I really need to replace it, and it's kind of gone bad. And as a result, it doesn't cover very well, and the only way I've really been able to save it is to thin it out quite dramatically. So it works well with the airbrush and multiple layers, but hand brushing it is not fun. And painting yellow by hand is never really fun because of coverage issues, especially if you're painting over a darker color. One of the things that I recommend that I honestly should have done here is trying to get to a brighter color. I should have used either a brighter blue or a neutral gray, and then eventually some kind of off-white, and then started painting yellow on top of that. I would have had a much vibrant color, much more faster. However, I am both stubborn and lazy, and it was late at night when I was doing this, and I really wasn't thinking about it, and I just kind of pushed forward and just kept layering and layering and layering until I ended up with something that worked. I then used Agrax Earthshade in between those two shoulder pauldrons as well as around the outside edge along the top there. That's just to add some separation and to bring in that definition again. By having such a flat or such a bright color, you kind of lose the definition of the shape of that shoulder pauldron, so you kind of got to bring it back in, either using something like an Agrax Earthshade or a Seraphim Sepia, and just really get that definition back in there, and then clean up any excess mess with some yellow, and then do any weathering that you feel needs to be done across the rest of your miniatures. And there we have it, folks, the final result. The only thing I didn't put on camera is I used Astro Granite Debris for the base. That is a technical paint by Games Workshop. It's a really nice product. It's kind of got like a sandy texture to it, and you just kind of slap it onto the base and let it dry. The thicker you put it on, the more interesting the shapes you get. In my opinion, though, that works best if you're applying it prior to painting the miniature, as you can kind of get really messy with it and really get it looking quite interesting. However, it works just fine the way that I've used it here, where you kind of get this nice mottled texture all over everything. Continuing forward, though, I would like to say that I personally don't like super over heavily weathered miniatures, which is why I haven't gone like super over the top with these and adding tons of like mud effects and all sorts of stuff around the boots. Again, I like the idea of these like real technical specialty units, and if we look at the Warhammer lore, a lot of the time they're taught that your equipment is an extension of yourself, and that you should keep your equipment clean and you should keep it pristine because it is a direct representation of the Emperor and the Emperor's might, and that might that you wield against the enemy of the Imperium. So in my mind, it makes sense for them to try to keep their equipment as clean as possible until they go out into the field, which is another reason why I don't tend to make my stuff overly messy and overly weathered. But I really love the way that these guys turned out. If I could change one thing, I would put some more black lining on things to really help things pop out. I would go through and put a little bit more definition around on all the miniatures. And that's just something that I would do just to make things pop a little bit more. I don't enjoy doing that necessarily. It's kind of soul crushing for me. It's a very slow, very tedious process, and it's not something that I enjoy. So for gaming miniatures and something that I'm going to use casually, I don't tend to do that. So you'll see me do that on more show pieces and pieces where I'm really trying to show off my skill, but on stuff like this, I tend to not do that. I wanted to go ahead and answer that question because I've had people over on TikTok ask me why I do that on some pieces, why I do all the black lining, and then on other pieces I do almost no black lining at all. And it really comes down to how much time I want to spend on the miniature. In any case, I hope you guys really enjoyed watching today's video, and I hope you guys learned something, you took away something that is useful for you to apply to your own collection. And as always, I hope your display case is always overfilled and your pile of shame never runs empty. Until next time.